presenting this probably on behalf of a few other people. I just want to acknowledge Dave Kendall from the University of Tasmania, Paul Smith from Botanic Conservation International, and last but not absolutely least, Claire Hart and Tessa Coombe from Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria. So we've worked together on a few projects, which you'll get to see a bit of today. The nature of the presentation, I'll be going through some possibly heavy background information on risks to plants for climate change. So if you hate that sort of thing, you'll just have to put up with that for a little while. Then we'll move into the tools that are available to help people with their adaptation to climate change risks. I really wanted to acknowledge the traditional
Hey, Pete, it just looks like you're on mute there, mate.
Sorry, I'm back again.
Yep, all good.
Sorry about that. Just wanting to acknowledge the traditional owners of country.
You mute again, Peter.
Why is that happening? Sorry, I'm not doing that. Back again. So just wanting to pay respects to those cultures and to their elders past, present and emerging. And look, the point I wanted to make here is that Indigenous mobs have lived with a changing environment land for over 60,000 years. Adaptability is really the longevity of their culture, and we can learn from that adaptability ourselves in the Western world. Some of this presentation is going to be fairly generic, so I haven't pitched it for Australia, but you could apply this to Australia to a large extent. We're seeing, typically, potentially by 2081, 2100, under an immediate sort of emissions, we're looking at a 2 to 3.5 degrees Celsius rise. If mankind doesn't get its act together, no mitigation of emissions, then we could be looking at 4.4 degrees Celsius by the turn of the century. But for all scenarios, and some of these are probably already now locked in already, we're likely to see increased frequency of heat waves. These are compounded by dry, so being warmer, more evapotranspiration, drought. And a lot of land regions are expected to experience more intense and frequent rainfall. For those in tropical regions, good news, could be getting more powerful cyclones. There's some evidence to suggest they may be less frequent, but when they do come, they'll be a bit more than what people have experienced potentially. One of the things I wanted to mention about surface air temperature rising, these are averages for the globe. And when you're looking at land surfaces, the global warming is typically 1.5 times this. So it's not all warming is equal. So you might see even higher increases this over land surfaces. One of the things that botanic gardens have to face as being in urban centres, and even here in Cooktown, the buildings and thermal mass of roads, etc., that all amplifies the temperature rise even higher. These sorts of increases are generally not factored into these projections, so you have to assume a higher rise for areas with high urban density. And of course, it's not just temperature, it's floods, it's waterlogging, it's a whole range of things that we may experience. I wanted to go through some physiological stresses for plants, and so I'm going to go through a range of looking at the range of risks for plants with climate change, and these are not exclusive, there's many more. One of the things that's been observed around the world already is that drought and higher temperatures have been associated with increased forest deaths, and this covers a range of vegetation types and continents. So it's not just dry forests, it's rainforest and a whole range of things. In Australia, one study was done of 17 forest die-offs across the continent, And they occurred across varying soil types and elevation, so it's not always associated with a dry environment. This increasing hotter drought syndrome basically impacts on a plant's capacity to maintain its water potential or its water mechanism, and to store non-structural carbohydrates. And what we mean by that is sugars and starches. The two sort of avenues for failure or damage to plants are what we call hydraulic failure, fancy term for basically describing air bubbles in the xylem or the conducting vessels of the plant. Once there's air embolisms or air bubbles, the plant is able to conduct that water in a continuous stream. Some species can repair that, other species are stuck with it. The other mechanism, and these are theoretical reasons for failure, is what they call carbon starvation. So what that means is, if you're a conservative species, you don't like taking risks. As soon as the evaporation demand gets high above your optimum, you shut down all the stomata in your cells. And as we know, you need stomata or the pores in the cells to be open to be able to photosynthesize and to be able to store food. So species that are conserved and keep shutting down all the time, their food reserves run low, their respiration exceeds photosynthesis, and they just basically run out of food to survive. Conifers are a group particularly in this sort of field. And just looking at those images there on the right, on the top right image, you can see some plant failure in the Melbourne Gardens, the Royal Botanic Gardens, Victoria. I would probably say these are from hydraulic failure during a heat wave. And on the left, we have Sequoiadendron giganteum at the Ballarat Botanic Gardens, and this was very interesting to look at. Most of the damage and loss on that tree is on the north side, the most exposed side. Now, I'm not saying that's definitely due to evaporative demand, but it is interesting to look at. Now, this could also be a loss of food, actually preferentially on that side of the tree. But one of the alarming things that's been, I suppose, reported by the researchers is what we call vapor pressure deficit or evaporative demand. And the issue under climate change is, as temperatures rise, there's an exponential increase in that evaporative demand. And that makes it difficult because atmospheric water demand is increasing while soil water availability is potentially decreasing with drought. So these are potentially quite serious threats for plants. The other area where plants struggle under climate change is, they have altitudinal and geographic limits. And in Australia, our mountains aren't great. At an average 330 metres altitude, Australia is the lowest continent in the world. So we don't have a lot of capacity for plants to move elevation. A lot of them are going to be stuck. That picture on the left of my son's up on near Mount Howard in Victoria, Australia. It's alpine country in Victoria, one of my favourite places. Snow gums as a species, they typically grow above about 1,300 metres. And there's concerns about those from a climate change perspective, but it may not be as simple as what we might think. So basically, some of the theory is that they may be moving upwards with warming, but what also is happening is a complex between bushfire and vegetation competition. So bushfires are burning more frequently, other shorter-lived vegetation's moving in and actually pushing snow gums out. But a lot of species around the world are moving upwards in elevation, and that's been observed. Some are moving downslope, and some of that is believed due to precipitation change. But there is already observed changes to plants, but there's limits. So in terms of the potential effect on plants globally, if we could hold warming to 2 degrees, we're looking at about 16% of plants, their climatically defined range will be halved. One researcher suggested that 44% could lose more than half their range with warming of 3.2 degrees. So I'm suggesting that we're probably going to experience that 2 degrees C if we get our act together. That's probably almost locked in. Sorry, let's come back to that slide, sorry. I just wanted to mention this Araucaria angustifolia, which is an interesting one. One study looking at this in Brazil. We have Araucarias in Australia. I don't know if the same sort of predictions apply, but under a high emission scenario for Araucaria in Brazil, by 2085, they're looking at 65 to 88% reduction in range. And this is complexed by the fact that the remaining area which the Araucaria grows is an unprotected area. So not only potentially losing its range, but it's suddenly in an area where there's no actual legislative protection. So the last lots of it might be cleared for timber, whatever. Many plants are unable to actually track the rate of climate change. Plants being fixed organisms can't readily move along like animals can, obviously. And one species that's interesting, or one group of plants, eucalypts, they have been found to have quite poor mechanisms for dispersal. So you're looking at potentially being able to move 1 to 2 metres per year by seed dispersion. So if we looked at a theoretical eucalypt needing to move potentially 800,000 metres by 2090, it can only actually move 1/10,000th of the distance required to match that temperature change. Clearly can't do it. The other image I have here is for plants growing in Canada, and this is an interesting image because it combines the climate stress with the plant's capacity to disperse. And you can just see from that image potentially a wide range of species that are really in trouble in terms of the climate stress and their dispersal capability as a rare plant. In Australia, we're very familiar with bushfire. So climate change, we get this higher risk of extreme and potentially what you could term extinction events. And this is because as average temperatures go up, the frequency of extreme events in terms of temperature become more frequent. But this could also include floods, a whole range of things. So in terms of fire severity and frequency, we've already seen fires. We all know about fires burning into rainforests where typically that wasn't experienced. And in my own lifetime, I've seen large stands of Australian montane trees such as Nothofagus cunninghamii, Antarctic beech. These stands, mature vegetation and believed to be several hundreds of years of old, and they've been decimated by fire. You go up there and all the trees are dead. So maybe that's a signal that things have changed. But it's heat waves as well. In one study in Western Australia in 2011 found that heat waves had basically increased mortality by about 20% in that region of the world. These sorts of things are probably likely to become more often and more severe. We're familiar with pests and we're very familiar with myrtle rust now in Australia. It arrived in 2010. Could be argued whether the climate was made more suitable for it, but it's probably going to become more suitable in cooler areas. And it was a bit of a nightmare in Melbourne Gardens when it arrived because the Victorian authorities were trying to contain it. But new incursions that really affect our biodiversity. So new pests. But what about existing ones? So Botryopsferia, it's a branch canker fungus. It typically will just kill branches. In this example, Banksia saxicola, it's killed the whole tree. Claire was very keen for me to include an image of an axe in it, just to frighten everybody. You can see the blue staining down here. So with increased waterlogging and stressful conditions, this is a fungus that attacks stressed plants. You might have the same disease or pest, but it actually gets worse because of the change in environmental conditions. So of all these things I've shown, I'm going to show you one more. What we've got to consider is one change of dynamics for one plant in an ecosystem can cause a whole cascade of other impacts. And these are just some of the risks that we're facing. I looked for a bit of work related to subtropical and tropical floras. So I was thinking of my Queensland colleagues here. There's been studies looking at germination fitness of plants. And by 2070, it's believed that over half of tropical species will be experiencing temperatures exceeding their optimum germination, and some of them are experiencing that already. So it means in the natural environment, their capacity to recruit or reproduce is going to be limited. There's already been seen in tropical environments that leaf surface temperatures are going above the optimal thresholds for photosynthesis, and this is expected to get worse. Some plants may be able to acclimatise, but basically we're getting an increasing risk of tropical plants not being able to photosynthesize at the same rate. One of the interesting things about this is they're not photosynthesizing at the same rate, they're not storing carbon as the same rate, which could be a feedback loop, which means more carbon gets released in the atmosphere. In rainforests, there's been studies looking particularly in northeast Queensland, the wet tropics. One of the impacts can be reductions in cloud condensation, and this typically occurs around 600 metres, but I've seen this occurring locally on Mount Cook at 400 metres. But for every 1 degree rise, this condensation effect rises 100 metres. So species that are reliant on this for capturing precipitation, and ecosystems that rely on this capture of water for stream flows are going to be affected. We've already talked about more frequent and intense fires occurring in rainforests as well. So here's a lot of the natural effects that we may see. I'm flying along actually, that's good. Wanted to work through a couple of tools that are available to help you with adapting to climate change. So at the Congress that was held in Melbourne back in September, there were two tools that were launched by the Climate Change Alliance, the Botanic Gardens, and I've got my Climate Change Alliance hat on. One was the Landscape Succession Toolkit, which I'll talk you through now. I need to acknowledge BGANZ basically funded the publication of this toolkit, and Rebecca's actually sitting in the chat, I think, and she was a key part of getting this to a public-ready document. I was involved, I suppose, as a prime author, sort of pulling the information together originally. But essentially, this toolkit is what we believe is the first of its kind in the world in terms of helping botanic gardens prepare their own frameworks for adapting landscapes during climate change. And it really looks at how you might transition your landscapes and plant collections or make them more resilient for a climate future. I've included some shots of what it looks like. So basically what the toolkit does, it articulates the many benefits of landscape adaptation and succession. And from a philosophical perspective, we're assuming we have to adapt. Most older botanic gardens are already in a climate space beyond from which they are created. So we already have to adapt whether we accept that or not. The toolkit helps you, gives you a head start of how you might build your own knowledge and understanding of climate. It talks about the practical applications of adaptive management, and adaptive management is a very key thing to adopt, is learn how to adapt and continue to change in order the things that you value can stay at least more or less the same. And importantly, it provides you guidance on how you might structure and develop your own strategy or planning document. I wanted to talk about this step here. This is almost like a continuous improvement cycle, but it's been done in a way, a stepped process of how you might approach planning. So, to develop an understanding of climate change starting now, if people listening really don't understand what your climate change impacts are for your garden or for your region, find out. That may actually drive what you might do next. From that, you can identify what those risks are for your organisation or for your landscape. What are the things that we are going to face? Are we going to face increased bushfire risk? Are cyclones going to become more powerful? Or even in situ in your garden, things like algal blooms or increased water plant growth going to be an issue for managing lakes. The basically principle is start prioritising your species selection for those of less risk from the future climate. If you have a multi-species garden, including exotics, you might look at growing species that you think will be at less at risk. And if you have species that you think are vulnerable, and if they have conservation importance, please duplicate, share that material with gardens that are from a cooler climate that can actually grow them. If you're growing flora off the local area, that becomes challenging because, like here at Cooktown, it's difficult for us to change our species because we're representing the flora of Cape York. And in those cases, you may need to start doing more observations and more research to better understand the vulnerability of your local flora. So it's more challenging for gardens that are growing local flora to adapt. I think very importantly is build your collaboration and develop a diversity of partnerships. If you don't have those relationships in place now, it's not too late. Start working with universities, natural resource managers, anybody really, because what I found in my experience, starting from a low base of knowing very little, it's when you start to work with these other people that you develop your own network of knowledge and expertise. You're effectively networking your intelligence in a way. But the really key thing is adopting adaptive management and continuous improvement. So you try things. If they don't work, you go back to the drawing board and you start again. But the key thing is that we continue to adapt and try to keep up with the changes at least. Don't sit in a static frame of mind. So the one I really wanted to spend time on was the climate assessment tool, because I know that you're all very excited to see this. I'm going to go through some theory because I think it might help you understand why it is the way it is. But we'll have some time to play around with it later. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about ecological niche theory. So this is the basically theory for where organisms sit in the natural environment and why they're found in I suppose, a certain environmental space. So I'm going to just run a very simple model for you to help explain this. And this is very simple because we're just looking at two parameters. We're looking at precipitation or rainfall and temperature. And so we're mapping an imaginary space for plant X that will sit against these axes. But this is a very simple model. So if we have a plant that occurs in this virtual space of a certain level of range of precipitation and temperature, in the natural world, we call this the realised niche. So this is what you could say, the environmental envelope for a natural distribution of a plant. And that plant can be constrained by where it grows because of competition, pests, germination inhibitors, and other interactions. But what if that plant is grown in cultivation, or some of these other inhibiting or competition factors are changed? We have what's called the fundamental niche. So this is the space where plants can potentially grow if we might remove some of those inhibiting factors. And this is what we see in botanic gardens. So if we're growing plants and cultivating them, we provide irrigation, we control pests, we jump past any germination inhibitors because we grow plants in a nursery. The species we grow can grow in a much wider range of environmental conditions. And that's important to know when you're looking at climate risk, because the risk for plants and cultivation may not be as dire because we can actually overcome some of these other stresses. So typically in cultivation, plants may occur a much broader range of temperature and precipitation and other factors than what we might see in the natural world. And I've experienced this in Melbourne Gardens, my former organisation. Species that had rainfall in the natural world of 1,300 millimetres are quite happily chugging along at 800 millimetres per year, as an example. So the methodology basically intersects the occurrences of trees. So the tool's quite focused just on trees currently. It basically intersects of where those trees occur with these bioclim spatial layers from WorldClim. So bioclim are bioclimatic variables. They're derived from monthly temperature and rainfall values to really try and develop things that are more biological meaningful, but think of them as layers of environmental layers. So for example, annual precipitation, mean annual temperature are two bioclim layers. If you look at those images there, you'll see the blue one and you'll see the more brightly coloured one. Top one's being precipitation. Effectively, we can model rainfall from observed weather stations for just about every, at this stage, square kilometre of the world's surface or land surface. So it means if you don't have a weather station handy, you can actually model what the rainfall would be for an XY coordinate anywhere pretty much in the world. We can also do that with temperature. And this is what enables us to match climatic factors with where plants occur. So in the climate assessment tool, we have mean annual temperature, we have the mean temperature of coldest quarter, mean maximum temperature of warmest month, mean annual precipitation, etc. Just a few. These are bioclim parameters, so you can model these as layers across the world's surface. But the main factor that is used is mean annual temperature. This has been actually found as a useful predictor or proxy for where plants might occur. It's not a cause in itself, which I'll come to. And then from that, we can derive models of a typical species, which is typically around 11 degrees Celsius or its temperature envelope, mean annual temperature range. So all this data is from WorldClim. You can do the same sort of analysis in GIS, and I can do this myself. It just takes so much longer to do it in a different platform. I should point out that trying to run this sort of work manually, it could take you weeks to really pull together the data from one plant, and we can do it much more quickly now. The other, I suppose, data input to the climate assessment tool are these mega data sets that exist. So we have a data set called GBIF, Global Biodiversity Information Facility. Currently, it has 340 million georeference records for plants across the world sitting in there. So it basically means that these plants have coordinates of where they occur. And we're typically around 390 to 400,000 taxa of plants that are also included. So in the climate assessment tool, it pulls in 4 data sets. One is plants in their natural range, so from the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, but that data has been cleaned by Botanic Gardens Conservation International. We also have a data set for all data in GBIF, including naturalised and cultivated records. It also brings in urban tree inventories from 300 cities and plant search, which is basically the records that are provided by Botanic Gardens. So it includes the natural information, but also the cultivated information. Remember, I talked about the realised niche and the fundamental niche for plants. So the natural environmental space, but also the cultivated space, which is really important when we're trying to really understand what the total risk is. And then from this, a model of a typical species can be developed, which I've sort of mentioned earlier. So what does this look like? And I just need to acknowledge Dave Kendall here because I'm very much plagiarising his slides with his permission. But if we look at Eucalyptus leucoxylon, it's a southern species, or yellow gum that occurs south. You'll see a image here of, I suppose, number of records mapped against temperature. And you can see the species has a sort of sweet spot around this sort of between 14 and 16 degrees. And this is where it occurs in Australia, and that's this is the species here. So essentially, we can develop a temperature envelope for this tree. This is its natural occurrence, typically. So it's only got like a 2 degrees bandwidth, but in cultivation, this could be actually a bit broader. One of the things to really understand is mean annual temperature is not the mechanism itself causing plant death or decline. It's I suppose, a measuring tool. It's a proxy for indicating a range of factors. And some of these could be water use, pests and diseases, competition, minimum or freezing temperature. It basically indicates where a plant occurs as an indicator, not a cause of itself. Some people will say, well, why not rainfall? Why isn't that not used in the tool? Well, drought is actually different to rainfall. You can have low rainfall and still have moist areas in the world. And also, we can more readily compensate for rainfall discrepancies by irrigating. The problem with temperature is we can't really compensate for temperature, and studies that I've been involved in Melbourne, we found that even microclimate management is very difficult to manage temperature across a landscape. You could only manage about 1 or 2 degrees at best. So using microclimate planning in your landscape is not really effective. The only way you can really mitigate things is by shading and wind protection. But if you're trying to mitigate temperature, it's actually very difficult. But if we can irrigate, then we can compensate for rainfall. So if we apply some climate scenarios, so if we look at Corymbia citridoria, lemon centre gum, and I'm assuming this is based on Melbourne conditions. So Melbourne historically was sitting around below 15 degrees. If we were selecting Corymbia for the future under shared socio-economic pathway, so this is a climate model, the intermediate missions by 2050, it's pretty much in the sweet spot for Melbourne. So this would be theoretically an ideal tree for Melbourne gardens. And even under a more business as normal scenario where humans don't get their act together and we get a very much larger increase, that tree is still sitting within the ballpark of Melbourne's conditions. When it comes to the climate assessment tool, you'll see scoring. The scoring are indicator values. I wouldn't get hung up on whether it's a 3, a 2 or a 1, but they are a measure of risk. So for our Corymbia citridoria, if you see a score of 3 and it's green, it's basically saying it's in its sweet spot of its temperature envelope. If it gets a 1 or a 0, it's on the edge of its distribution, or it's just not known to occur, or not known to occur currently. So really, if you're looking at from a risk perspective, you're really looking for sort of 2s and 3s sitting in that sort of range, or where the plant's going to end up under a certain climate scenario. We're also able to do a batch analysis, so we're able to upload a list, and the climate assessment tool will run you a report based on those species. It's a little confusing at the moment because it actually is a different scoring system, but there is documentation information available on how to unpick that. So if it's getting a 0, it's just not known and not likely. Gets an 11, it's sitting within that middle range, which I talked about before. So I thought it's just good to go over the background. If there's questions later, I'll try and explain it. I'm not the scientist, but I've been working with this for some time, so hopefully I can answer. So what I wanted to do now is actually do some real examples. I think this is probably what you're going to be more excited by. And I've picked on Brisbane Botanic Gardens because I know Ross DeMuth down there. And I've actually got actual photos of trees that I took back in 2019 of Cryptomeria japonica and Adamsonia digitata. And I thought these would be good worked examples. So what I'm going to do now is go to the tool and we'll run these examples, and hopefully everything works. You have to realise, being in Cooktown, our bandwidth here is not necessarily great, so things might run a bit slower, so just hold your breath. So I'll just pull up, hopefully everyone can see this. Someone jump in and unmute and tell me if you can't, otherwise I'll assume that you can. So I'm just going to type in Brisbane Botanic Gardens Mount Cootha there. And then we want our species, so we'll do, can't spell. So it gives you a drop-down list, Cryptomeria japonica. And then we can say, okay, what climate change scenario you want to look at? And let's have a look at current climate for Brisbane. Is this a great tree for the Brisbane Botanic Gardens? This might take a little while to process, so just hold your breath. And there we have the result. Now, that all looks great, happens really quickly. To do this sort of analysis manually, there'll be days, possibly weeks. This all happens at a flick of a switch. So I'll just explain the tool before we look at the scores. We've got the assessment results for where this plant occurs in a location. There's also a documentation up here on the top right, which shows you how to use the tool. I won't pull that up now because I think it might just take too long. It provides you down here on the bottom left the projected climate details of the garden based on that climate scenario. In a lot of cases for city gardens, this should be quite accurate for mean annual temperature, but for other locations, there may be some variance, and annual precipitation is definitely not as accurate, but it gives you a bit of an idea of what the parameters are at your garden on this climate scenario. At the bottom right here, we have the risk codes. Talked about these earlier. If you're a 0, it's just not known to occur at this temperature. You may know this species are growing these temperatures, but if it's not being documented or included on any of these databases, then it can't be basically included. So the emphasis here is if you've got known distributions and they're not in the system, get them in there. And then these are pretty much self-explanatory at the rest here. If you look at the source, remember I talked about the 4 databases. So we have 4 databases being analysed here. So GBF BGCI is the natural range, or we talked about the realised niche. So under its realised niche, this plant tends to drop out around a mean annual temperature of 17 degrees. But if we include naturalisation and cultivate occurrences with GBIF, we see that it's actually been found up to 21. So its capacity to grow under a warmer temperature is higher than what we would assume from the natural world. The model says a similar thing. Urban plants, which is trees growing from cities, puts it up at 1 more. And then if we look at plant search, which is botanic gardens, we find that there's obviously a number of botanic gardens growing this species under a warmer climate. And that would be, Brisbane Botanic Gardens would be one of those, because we can see already it's not meant to be suitable. So you've got a range of databases here that you can make some informed decisions about whether this species needs protection or will be much suitable for a warmer climate. When you're in this part of the tool, you can actually also just jump here and you can say, okay, it doesn't look that great under current conditions, but what happens by 2090? So it's really starting to drop out. So if I was a manager of Brisbane Botanic Gardens and my local council come up to me and said, we want to plant avenues of Cryptomeria japonica up the main driveway to the gardens, I would be strongly resisting. This does not mean that the species won't survive, it's just a higher risk of it not surviving. And would you take that risk of a whole avenue of trees? I would suggest not. Because one of the things we have to think about is the decisions we make right now, we're going to have to live with those decades into the future. If I plant this avenue of street trees and it fails, I've got a massive failure on my hands to deal with. If I diversify and look at species that are more suitable, then my failure is not going to be as great if 1 or 2 of them fail. So that's the way we have to think. We've got to be thinking decades ahead, because what we do now is going to be affected by the climate of the future. I'll go back again and we'll throw in here again. We'll just pull up. So you'll probably want to have a play with this yourselves later on. It's pretty intuitive. You just have to type in the location. If you know your garden has the place name there, we'll find it. If I type in Cook, it'll pull up Cooktown Botanic Garden, for example. So we'll look at Ada and Sony at Vegetata. And we'll say, okay, let's look at current climate again. And so it's growing in Brisbane Botanic Gardens currently. It's at the actual lower end of its range. Not surprisingly, if we look at plant search, it's been grown in much cooler gardens. Now, some of these need to be viewed with some disclaimers, because they could be growing in a glass house. Currently under plant search, we're not able to really pull out plants that might be sitting in glass house. So I would suggest down at this lower range here, they're probably sitting in a glass house somewhere. I'll be looking more at the urban plants and the model for guidance. So maybe down to 19 or 18 degrees, probably not much lower than that. But for Brisbane Botanic Gardens, this is a good species, because if we look at business as usual, it's pretty much getting into the sweet spot of where that tree will grow. And as I talked before, there's other parameters that we can look at in terms of precipitation, driest quarter, and ranges of where it's found. The other thing I should have mentioned is there's also a column here for records. And you want to look at the records with some caution. Like under urban plants, there's only 10 records. I would not see that as a very strong result. You've only got 2 occurrences for the plant. you probably want at least 20 occurrences before you start to put any value on the results. So just be aware of that. So the next one I wanted to do, I'll just jump back to find my presentation. No, it's not going to do it for me. Okay, back to here. So the next one that I wanted to do as a worked example was a batch assessment of threatened taxa at coordinates the Iron Range National Park. Now this could be a real scenario because we are at Cooktown Botanic Gardens facing a road modification project where threatened and near threatened species will be required to be propagated. And we need to, we might want to look at their climate risk currently, what's facing them in this region. So this is a real project. And we now have the capacity to run analysis against coordinates as well as uploading a whole list. So I'll jump back to our climate assessment tool. If anything's not working, please jump in and tell me because I've got no idea. I've got no idea whether you can see it or not. I've already preloaded a tab. So I'll put the latitude and longitude in here. So we don't fill out location, we just put out latitude and longitude. And I believe this is running off WGS 84, the typical datum that is used for Google Maps and Google Earth and things like that. So we jump to taxon. In this case, we don't want to upload a single species, we want to upload a file. So upload file, because I've been naughty and cheated way in advance, I've already got it here. Open that. And I'm going to look at this scenario here. This will take a little time. But it's actually pretty fast. It's a lot faster than trying to do this on the desktop. Now, the reason I brought this one up is you'll see some species are not found, and that's typically because they're not defined as trees. Remember I said that we got about 59, or around about 59,000 tree records in here. If the species is not defined as a tree, you won't get a result. Remember I talked about the climate ratings being a little different, but they give you some idea of where that plant sits in that bell curve or envelope. So it's getting a 2, not known but likely. There's only 40 occurrences of this Syzygium maconianum, so it might have quite a narrow range. But at the current temperature, it's saying, sorry, at the emissions limit 2050, it's suggesting this one in particular is going to be potentially more vulnerable than these other ones. So from a Botanic Gardens conservation perspective, we may spend a bit more effort on propagating a diverse range, I suppose genetically diverse population of this species. We may grow a seed orchard so we increase diversity because it's looking more at threat than some of these others. So from there, we can export results, can export an Excel file. I can pull that, open that up, and I'll pull it over to the screen. And it basically gives you an Excel dump of, and you notice it's only included the species that, oh, sorry, pull that back over. It's only included the species that actually were basically accessible, if you like. I would probably take a screenshot of your batch assessment and this because it doesn't include every bit of data, but essentially the key parameters are there and the climate ratings. Let's close that down. One of the things we can't run another analysis from this window. If you want to run business as usual, you have to go back to the start and start again. This is pretty much a bit of a tool in progress. It's undoubtedly going to be developed and improved as we go. We're finding all sorts of snappy little changes that we need to make. But a thing I will put to you is there was nothing like this in the world a month, say 3 months ago. You just could not do this sort of analysis so quickly. If you wanted to get environmental data for a plant in a given location, you would have to run some quite sophisticated models and it would take you a lot of time. Now you can get some estimates pretty much at the push of a button. So I think Botanic Gardens can be quite proud, and the Climate Change Alliance particularly, in pulling these sorts of tools together for practitioners like us who are managing these gardens. I'll just leave this here and go back to the presentation, and we can come back to it if you're interested. I was looking at the time. I'm pretty much running out, so I'll just quickly jump through these. So if you haven't joined, I encourage you to join the Climate Change Alliance of Botanic Gardens. You can join as a professional individual, but more importantly, if you're an organisation in Australia or Australasia, or if you're anywhere from the world today, please join up, because a stronger alliance means we can do more things like this. Currently, we've got 500 members from about 96 countries, and the alliance has already delivered 2 projects, the Toolkit and also this risk assessment tool. So it's kicking goals, but to continue to kick goals, we need a strong membership. So what should we do as managers of gardens? And when I say managers, that's everyone who empties the bins to high-level strategic executives. We're all involved in looking after our gardens. What are the things that we do need to think about? And I've stolen this from a BGCI summary because I actually thought it was quite a good one. But we really need to think about our climate adaptation. If we haven't got plans in place, we should really be starting to prepare those and making sure our staff are trained. We've mentioned this earlier, collaboration is really, really important. You want to be known for your capacity to have relationships than your capacity to compete with people. Isn't it wonderful? People say, Botanic Garden X, gee, they work really well with a lot of people. That's the sort of reputation that I want, and I think you probably do too. There's actually a range of tools that are now available to help you manage and respond to climate change. There's Toolkit, which BGANZ help fund, and that's freely available. I'll show you the link for that later. And the climate assessment tool. If you're in Queensland, that picture there is actually from a site called the Long Paddock, where you can actually do your own, I suppose, climate modelling for your area, or look at grids for temperature and rainfall. Anyone can basically use it. So if you haven't seen that, my fellow Queenslanders, I recommend you have a look at that resource as well. And I'm almost done. But lastly, but not leastly, I've just put up I suppose, a list of resources, networks and tools. You might be able to scan this from your phone now. If you can't access any of these, I'm sure after this presentation, I can work with BGANZ to send around the PDF version or whatever. So don't panic if you can't get onto it. But that scanning that QR code will actually take you to an American site that's got a few other things on it, but you'll find some of this almost straight away. Otherwise, just type in keywords. If you type in Landscape Assessment Toolkit, you'll find it. Probably Climate Assessment Tool, you'll find it as well. You might find that paper worth reading. It's freely available online. And there again, the Climate Change Alliance, I recommend that you jump on. If you want to look at an actual strategy, Royal Botanic Gardens Victorian Landscape Succession Strategy is also a really good resource to have a look at. But I'm pretty much done, so I will drop out of the presentation and stop.
Oh, lost you there, Pete. Yeah, I think we've lost Peter there for a little bit, everybody. So some of those links, just for everyone, that some of the things that Peter was mentioning there, Rebecca's shared. Oh, there you are, Peter. Just on mute.
Sorry, I closed the whole thing rather than dropping the screen share, but I'm here now.
That's all good, being nice and thorough. Yeah, I was just saying, so yeah, Rebecca shared a few of those links that we've mentioned, and we'll make sure that we'll try float around a PDF of that presentation and any other links to stuff mentioned throughout the presentation. Now, we were hoping for about 15 minutes or so of a bit of a Q&A, so we do have quite a number of people in here. If anyone did have questions, if you just want to use the chat feature, and we just might go through and see who's got relevant questions there and put them forward to Pete if possible. If anyone did have any questions. I think you've been pretty thorough there, Peter.
Someone's raised a question: is will the climate assessment tool be extended to other plants? That's a really good question. For us to do that, it needs more funding and more development, and some other plants have very large occurrences, so the actual processing speed might be slowed down. But look, I'm pretty sure it's the Alliance's wish that we could actually bring in more plants. It's certainly I'm pretty keen for it to cover a lot more than just trees. Trees was really chosen because the data was relatively clean and it was easier to deal with things like synonyms. If you work in this area and you're trying to work out what's a synonym not, it can drive you crazy. So yeah, so yes, the desire there is to increase. Someone's just asked a question about data sources. Actually, ALA records are a subset of GBIF, so the Global Biodiversity Information Facility should include the ALA records. They may not be completely up to date, but those ALA records, certainly for Australian native plants, are actually included in GBIF. So yes, that's already in there. Look, I'm happy to receive questions directly through Cody if people have got them. But look, I really just encourage you to jump in and start using it. If you've got species of concern, try it out. Look at these bugs or things you think could be improved, let us know. It's undoubtedly going to need to be refined and developed. But just keep in mind, we had nothing like this. I would have dearly loved to have had this 10 years ago. So it's a pretty exciting chapter, I think, for Botanic Gardens. Yeah, Andrew's just mentioning people probably ask questions at the Congress. But if you think of something after the presentation and thought, gee, I wish I'd asked that, it's not too late. We're getting a few queries on the CAT directly. People start asking about methodology and that. And bear in mind that the Climate Change Alliance has one person working part-time and only probably put a few hours into it each week. So, you know, at the moment, we struggle for capacity to respond to everything, but we'll do our best to, you know, respond to your questions. But, you know, you've got some really good tools there to help you with your management. And I suppose my encouragement is if you don't really understand what could be happening for your region, you need to do that first. You really need to get on board with what the risks are, because you can't afford not to do anything. And particularly when you're starting to make decisions about your collections and your plants going forward.
All right, well, good. Well, I think we'll circulate a bit of an info kit afterwards for everyone, but if no one else has got any further questions, Rebecca's just put, yeah, she'll be putting a link to recording in the next BGANZ. So yeah, we'll make sure to circulate that around. That way, anyone who's missed at your individual organisations, we can float it around to them. But look, I think big thank you to Peter, mate. Great presentation, and I think it's a huge achievement to have a toolkit like this at our fingertips. Now it's going to make it very easy for managing into the future. So thanks again on behalf of everyone, mate.
Yeah, thanks, Cody. It was great to be able to share that with others. So